It had taken me almost 3 days to convince myself to make the trip. My daughter had told me that her husband's family wanted to get to know me better, that they were organizing a small reunion for the weekend, and that it would be nice if I were there. Time had passed. Too much time. Ever since I found myself alone after my husband's death, every invitation had sounded more like a duty than a sincere desire. But that time I had decided to say yes. I prepared the suitcase calmly, folding the clothes as if I were trying to endow them with a special dignity. I had even dusted off that old gold pendant with a photo of my daughter as a child that I hadn't worn in years. I wanted her to know that, despite everything, I was still the same mother, perhaps more tired, but always present. I had planned to leave early in the morning, but an unforeseen event had forced me to leave home in the early afternoon. The road to get to the town where she lived was long, and the train ride left me with only an hour to spare before my dinner appointment. Despite it all, as I looked out the window and the landscapes rushed past like faded recollections, a thought came to me unexpectedly. Bring something. A cake, perhaps. I didn't want to show up empty-handed. My mother always said that a woman never knocks on a family's door without bringing sweetness. But when I got off at the station and saw a small pastry shop on the corner, I decided to go in. The sky was already on the verge of giving way to evening. The air was heavy with that familiar smell of sugar, cream, and the passing of time. Inside, the pastry shop was half empty. A young woman with a stroller was the only customer paying at the counter. Exhaustion was evident in her eyes. The counter was elegant, made of light marble, and on it were simple but well-made cakes. I picked a lemon cake, frosted with a lustrous white glaze, and finished with delicate woven lemon zest on top. Nothing pretentious, I thought, just a cake made the way they used to make it. When I went to the checkout, the man at the counter, a young man perhaps in his mid-30s, with a short beard and a calm voice, looked at me with eyes that I couldn't read. I gave him my credit card. He swiped it, then looked at the screen, saw the name. His face changed in a second. At first he was neutral, then he seemed to be struck by an invisible shock. He stared at me with an expression halfway between fear and respect. Then, unexpectedly, he took my hand. "Lady," she murmured, leaning a little towards me, as though we were sharing a secret. I shouldn't say it here. Not with that name. He remained motionless. The sound of the refrigerator behind me had become deafening. I couldn't make out my name, the name I had lived by my whole life, my husband's last name still engraved on the ring I wore on my finger. "Excuse me," I said in a low voice, but he had already withdrawn his hand, was looking around nervously, and handing me the box with the cake. "Thank you for buying. Have a nice evening." His tone had returned to normal, but something inside him was trembling. He left without asking anything else. The box in his hands had suddenly become heavy. I made no attempt to go either to the bus stop or the taxi. I walked around the building, trying to breathe calmly. I stopped behind the bakery, where there was a half-open service door and a small, deserted parking lot. The sky was changing color, a mix of pink and blue that looked badly painted. Leaning against a low wall, I tried to understand why that boy was so upset by my name, why he had whispered those words as if we were talking about something forbidden. 5 minutes later, the back door opened cautiously. The same man came out, looking around. His hand held a small white envelope, secured tightly with a strip of black tape. He didn't see me. He was talking on the phone, his voice low, but distinct enough for me to catch a few sentences. Did Inlu really buy it? Yes, that's her. The name was on the receipt. No, he didn't understand a thing. I swear she's alive. My heart stopped, not out of fear, but out of confusion, because his voice was shaking with something that wasn't simple concern, it was amazement. It was as if he were talking about a ghost he thought he'd never see again. She's alive. Those 2 words hammered incessantly in my ears as if someone, somewhere, had meticulously constructed a whole reality, an entire world entirely, around my absence. But I had never disappeared. I didn't go back to the main road. I sat down on a stone bench behind a hedge and, with the cake still untouched on my knees, I began to understand that this courtesy visit to my daughter's house would not be a simple family dinner, and that perhaps for years there had been another story that had been going on without me and perhaps against me. That boy was right. I shouldn't have said my name, but it was too late. My name had been enough to open a door. Now it was up to me to choose whether to go through it. I remained there, motionless, sitting on that rough stone bench, my hands clasped around the box of cake as if it contained a living heart. The evening was falling slowly, and the air had grown colder, but I didn't notice. The weight I felt on my legs wasn't the weight of the cake, but that of a truth that was pressing to come out. I could have laughed. I could have chosen to ignore that whispered plea, to forget the terrified look in her eyes and the devastating words. She's alive, words that had pierced my heart like a sharp blade. But something within me, a part that I had allowed to slumber for far too long, had been abruptly awakened. A part that fiercely refuses to be forgotten, or worse, to be replaced. I remained hidden behind the hedge, in a corner from which I could clearly see the back door of the pastry shop. The lights inside were still on, and the shadow of the man at the counter was moving frantically inside. A few minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Thereafter he heard a noise, the engine of a car turning off, followed by a door closing with deliberate caution. My body tensed like a bow. I didn't know what to expect. Suddenly, I spotted him, a tall, muscular man, with salt and pepper hair and a long gray coat that reached his knees. He was carrying a yellow envelope, the kind used for confidential documents. His walk was familiar, too familiar. As soon as he crossed the threshold of the back door, my throat tightened. I knew that face from before. But when was beyond me. That particular person had appeared in my memory some time before now. He was no stranger, not to me, and especially not to my daughter. The door closed, and the silence grew heavy. I stood up slowly, without making a sound, and took a few steps closer. The single window at the back was fogged up, but I could make out the figures. The man was talking to the boy at the counter, who was showing him something on a screen, perhaps a record of the sale. Then the man opened the envelope, pulled out a sheet of paper, and slapped it on the table. The boy read it, shook his head, and finally handed him my receipt. That receipt with my name on it. He could hear my heartbeat in his ears. I felt like throwing up. The man nodded. Then he put a hand on the boy's shoulder as if to say, "You did the right thing." And he left. He passed by my hiding place, but he didn't see me. The smell of his aftershave stabbed my chest. It was the same scent I'd smelled in my daughter's house when I'd visited her years ago, before she started telling me there was no room for me that weekend, or that the baby was sick and it wasn't the right time. It was the identical perfume that I had found lingering on a scarf, quite forgotten, in my kitchen when they dropped by for Christmas, only to depart 15 minutes later. Retreating into the shadows, I tried to piece together my jumbled thoughts. What was going on? Why on earth would a man with ties to my daughter care so much about the fact that I had used my name in a small-town bakery? Because she's alive, had to be said in that tone. I felt like an actress waking up in the middle of a play that had already begun, without a script, without knowing what role to play at all. And in the meantime, behind the scenes, someone had rewritten my part. He had taken my place. He emerged from the back door once more, just a few minutes after his initial exit. This time he was alone. He was looking around as if searching for something or someone. His hands were shaking. When he lit a cigarette and leaned his back against the wall, I decided to take a chance. I slowly came out of my corner and joined him. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he looked at me as if he expected to see me there. "I didn't want to put you in danger," he said quietly. "But you shouldn't have used that name. I'm not here." "Why?" I asked. "What does it all mean?" He hesitated, then gestured toward the parking lot. "Not who?" "I can tell you something if you want, but you have to leave now. They are searching for her, and it's not a joke." I wanted to ask more questions, but he threw the cigarette on the ground, crushed it, and went back into the bar, locking the door behind him. I stood there, shaking with the cake still clutched in my hands. Then I did something I didn't think I would do. I didn't take the train to my daughter's house. I changed direction. I took a taxi downtown. I had to understand. I had to know. Not out of revenge, not yet, but because something deep in my maternal instinct told me that what was happening wasn't just about me. It was about who I had been, who I still was, and who someone else was trying to become in my place. I stopped in front of a small copy shop that also offered internet access. It was late, but it was still open. I went in and asked for a computer. I paid in advance, wrote the guy's name on the receipt, and nothing. No trace. Then I tried the name of the man in the coat, the one with the all-too-familiar aftershave. There I found something, a connection, a company, an old clothes lawsuit, and another name that made my blood run cold, cold. It was mine, but it wasn't me. I hadn't eaten anything in hours. I didn't feel hungry, but I felt something worse. The feeling of having entered a room where everyone knows something except you. And as the cursor flashed on the screen and the website slowly loaded the details of the document, I realized that this journey would not lead me back to the arms of my family. It would lead me to the root of a lie, and that someone for years had been using my name to build a life that was not theirs, or perhaps to erase mine, Leaving the copy shop, my phone was overflowing with screenshots. My heart, equally burdened, felt heavy with uncertainty. I still held the cake tightly, although it was no longer destined for its intended recipient. Every step towards the hotel seemed like a confirmation. I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't imagining. There really was something underneath. Something that bore my name, but not my voice. Someone was walking through the world with my identity as if it belonged to them and had been doing so for a long time. I placed the box of cake on the coffee table in the room next to the empty ashtray. I looked at it as if it were an object from a different time. That cake had been a gesture of peace. Now it was just a symbol of how naive I had been. I didn't open it. I didn't taste it. I couldn't even touch it. It had become the boundary between what I thought I knew and what I was about to discover. I spent a good part of the night with my eyes wide open, scrolling through every corner of my memory. I wondered when it had all started. There was a time when I shifted from being a mother to becoming the problem. Perhaps that time was when I signed the proxy for my daughter's husband's company. Or perhaps it was years earlier when I consented to sell the old family apartment to help with the mortgage. I had always given, always trusted. I had believed that the blood bond was a guarantee, not a signature, to be exploited. I was wrong. The next morning, the first thing I did was go back to the website of the company I had found the night before. One name was nagging at me, Ryan Dolphy. He was listed as a co-founder of the company. That name was not unfamiliar to me. And then it struck me. The name belonged to my daughter's husband's mother, her maiden name to be precise. It was a woman I had always perceived as cold and detached, someone who, despite outwardly maintaining a polite demeanor, had never concealed her contempt for me. She had recently died, or so I had been told. But what was the reason her name was still present in the tax records? I opened a new tab and looked for the inheritance records. I entered my name out of curiosity, and there, in black and white, I saw something that took my breath away. A file in my name closed 2 years earlier. It indicated a transfer of assets in favor of a certain Dolphy, with a notarized signature. Except that I had never signed anything. Nor had I died, of course. My spine went cold. Someone had faked my death. Perhaps not in the strictest legal sense, but sufficiently to justify a redistribution of assets or a transfer of ownership. Both they had successfully constructed a legal and silent version of my absence. A ghost complete with a valid identity card. I decided to return to the pastry shop. Perhaps the boy could tell me more. But when I arrived, the shutters were down. A handwritten sign said, "Closed for inventory." The place looked abandoned. No movement at all. No trace of cream or sugar, only silence. I asked the bar next door if they knew the owners. The bartender told me that the place had only been rented for a few weeks by a catering company I had never seen before that had paid cash in advance. No one knew anything more. No one had ever seen the boy at the counter. No one even remembered his name. The cake returned with me to the hotel. It remained there, untouched, like a silent witness. I wasted no time. I went to the city library, asked for access to the digital archives, and started a search with every possible keyword related to my daughter, her husband, their company. After many hours of searching, I finally uncovered an interesting document, an old archive deed court ruling that mentioned Elvira Andolfi as a party implicated in an inheritance dispute. It wasn't my daughter. It wasn't me. But the tax code indicated in that case was identical to mine. My hands are shaking. I printed the document, folded it carefully, and put it in my notebook. Then I went out to get some air. I had to sit down. I had to stop the vortex that was swallowing me up. I found myself on a bench near the station. I watched people come and go, each one immersed in their own haste, their own life. And there I was, a 60-year-old woman who had lost everything without even realizing it. But I hadn't lost my memory. I hadn't lost my desire to understand. That same evening, I opened my old wardrobe, the one my daughter had asked to move to the garage because it was taking up too much space, and I looked for the red folder, where I had kept all the copies of the proxies signed over the years. I couldn't find it, of course. Then I remembered that during a visit to their house they had asked me to scan some documents and put them in the cloud itaud. I had left them with confidence and had never seen them again. Now everything was coming back. The signatures, the proxies, the transfers. But someone had built a network, a plot, and the common thread was always the same. My name. I didn't go back to my daughter's house. I canceled the visit. No one called to ask where I was. No message. No, where are you? Maybe they weren't really expecting me, or maybe they were hoping I wouldn't show up. I opened the cake box for the first time. It was still intact, perfect, a dessert for a family that no longer existed. I sliced a portion and consumed a small part of it slowly, almost in a solemn manner. It was good, but it had the bitter taste of silence. And in that silence, I promised myself that I would go all the way, not to get revenge, but to recover. That night, in the hotel room that smelled of industrial detergent and loneliness, I didn't sleep a wink, not out of fear, not out of anger, but because of something harder to name, something that resembled mourning, but it wasn't death, it was the processing of an absence created by others, the realization that while I thought I was the mother, the point of reference, the family anchor, someone else had taken on my role without ever looking me in the face. It was like discovering that someone had taken your voice and had been talking over it for years while you were whispering behind a closed door. I turned on my phone and opened my daughter's social media profile. I hadn't done so in a long time. Every time I visited it, I found filtered posts, smiles, and motivational phrases that seemed empty to me, as if the entire life she showed was a doctored version of something that no longer belonged to me. But this time I dug deeper. I started scrolling through the photos. Years of birthdays, dinners, trips, celebrations, and I wasn't there. I didn't appear in any of them. Not even a tag, not even a mention. But it wasn't just my absence that struck me. It was someone else's presence. In at least 6 separate photos, all with affectionate descriptions like moments with my queen or mom, who always spoils us. There was a woman, not much younger than me, maybe 10 years younger, hair dyed in ash, blonde, a wide smile, elegant, but sober clothes. In one photo, she was wearing a scarf identical to the one I had given my daughter earlier. In another, she was sitting on my old sage green couch, the one my daughter had said she had thrown away because it had been ruined by time. And in yet another, she was holding my grandson in her arms, one hand resting on the medallion I had given him for his baptism. I widened my eyes, zoomed in, and it was the same one. The little pendant with the words Grandma's love engraved on it, and the caption, "Thank you for the gift, Mom." Mom. Such careless use of that word cut me much more deeply than any blade of truth ever could. My daughter was calling another woman by the name she had been expecting for me. And not only that, she had let her into my space, my objects, my memories. She had rewritten the narrative, removing the root to graft another plant. I wondered who she was. I started reading the comments, looking for recurring names, clues, and finally I found an answer. There was a Christmas picture, and the same woman was shown cutting a slice of panettone. Someone posted the comment, "Is that really Aunt Elvira?" Yes. And my daughter had replied, "Yes, but now she's more of a mother than an Aunt Elvira." The name wasn't unfamiliar to me. It belonged to the younger sister of my daughter's father, the woman with whom I'd had a rather heated discussion years ago during the difficult period of our divorce when she was attempting to persuade my husband to sell our shared home and start completely over. A woman who had never approved of the way I was raising my daughter. Too strict for her tastes, too old-fashioned. I hadn't seen her since then. And now she was sitting in my chair, with my nephew on her lap, receiving notes that said, "To the best mother in the world." I went back to my feet with my heart pounding. I saw more details. A photo in the garden of my daughter's house showed a fountain that I had paid for with my severance money, but it was decorated with new lights, and the description said decorative project designed by Mom Elvira. The words had stopped being ink. They were scratches. It was no longer just a feeling. It was fact. They had replaced me, and they had done it with surgical precision. They had rewritten history, using pieces of my life to build a new one in which I did not exist, and no one had warned me. No one had even had the decency to invent an excuse. I got out of bed, walked around the room like a caged animal, looked at myself in the mirror. I wasn't looking for wrinkles or flaws. I was looking for confirmation that I existed, that it wasn't a hallucination, that I wasn't, as they evidently hoped, already dead and buried in the heart of my own daughter. I picked up the phone and tried calling her. 3 rings, then answering machine. I didn't leave a message. What could I say? Hello, I saw that you replaced your mother with a woman who hated me. No, not yet. I sat down, opened my paper diary, and wrote down a name, Elvira Andolfi. Beneath that, I circled another word, documents, because something inside me strongly suggested that this woman's infiltration extended beyond my family. It felt as though she might have also compromised my financial assets, my property, and even my potential inheritance, my property. And if that was the truth, I would not stop until I had unmasked her. I had spent years being invisible, kind, accommodating. Now was the time to be present and sharp. I woke up before it was even light with the distinct feeling that I had forgotten something important. It took me a few seconds to realize that this was not a dream. It was reality, and it was more intricate than I had ever imagined. On the nightstand, next to the off lamp, there was still the receipt from the pastry shop, crumpled at the edges and slightly damp with condensation. Nidand. I picked it up, and for the first time I looked at it carefully, not only because of the name printed on it, mine, the one that had made the boy at the counter tremble, but because of a final line that I had ignored, a string of numbers and letters, too long to be a tax code and too short for an invoice. At first I thought it was a mistake, but then I noticed the word in brackets next to the night order code, 1619. It was an abbreviation, an internal wording, perhaps something that indicated an order placed at night, an internal reference to the cash register, a code that shouldn't end up on a customer receipt date. That detail stabbed me like a pin under my fingernail. It wasn't normal. It wasn't there by chance. I read it and reread it, then copied it onto a sheet of paper, compared it with the initials of other receipts that I found in the wastebasket in the room. Nothing similar. Only mine had that note. And the question became even more insistent. What had I actually bought? A cake, certainly, but possibly also an accidental invitation or even an unintended ticket to something I should not have witnessed. I decided not to waste any time. I returned to the city center and headed toward the industrial area, where the night before I had noticed several warehouses with faded signs and semi-abandoned storage areas or oyulekies. I had no proof, only intuition, but at that moment my intuition was the only reliable compass I had left. Under a leaden sky, I walked for an hour, eventually spotting a white van parked in front of a building bearing the inscription Zifter, Gel Distributions, reserved entrance. On the door of the vehicle was a decal with the initials GDC 19. Those same letters appeared in the code on the receipt. I approached slowly, without attracting attention, and I noticed a man in a black uniform unloading boxes from a ramp. He was arranging them with slow, almost tired movements, as if he had been doing it for hours. I waited for him to come back in, and then I went around the building. At the back, between 2 dumpsters overflowing with plastic and paper, I found a half-open window. It was one of those warehouse windows high up, protected by a rusty grate. You couldn't see much, but you could hear everything. Voices, too. Maybe 3 men talking in low voices, as if who knows how every extra word could become a chain. The lady signed, one asked. Another hadn't answered yet. But if she goes into that house, is it over? Silence. Then a third said, she's already been alive too long. Those words petrified me. I wasn't sure they were talking about me, but every fiber of my body knew it was true. It wasn't paranoia. It was a visceral certainty, like when a mother hears her own child crying amidst 100 other children. I moved away cautiously and took refuge behind a hedge. I needed air, but air wasn't enough. The world around me seemed to have lost gravity, and yet every step I took was a step closer to the truth, Mefakti. I waited. The sun set slowly, and when the sky turned purple and the first streetlights came on, I saw this same boy from the pastry shop emerge from the opposite corner of the shed, wearing a hood pulled over his head and clutching a white bag in his hands. He didn't see me, got on a bike, and pedaled away quickly. He followed him on foot from a distance, keeping his distance from me, cutting through alleys and sidewalks on either side. After about 10 minutes, he stopped in front of a small side door in a building I recognized immediately. It was a small notary's office, one of those that does photocopies, certifications, and quick paperwork. There, I thought, were documents there. Perhaps my forged signature was inside. I waited for him. Then I went in. The woman at the reception looked at me with a distracted smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. She lied. I said I had lost a file in the name of Elvira Andolfi and that it had probably been delivered there by a boy on a bike. I pretended to be his sister. She hesitated, checked her register, and then said, "I'm sorry, we can't give you any information. But can I write down your phone number if you want?" I thanked her and left. I hadn't had the access I had hoped for, but I had confirmation. That name, that woman, wasn't just a face on my daughter's social media. She was a legal ghost, a presence built with papers and signatures, perhaps with access to accounts, properties, rights. The code printed on my receipt wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberately placed trap, a covert internal signal, as if my unexpected appearance had instantly triggered an alert. I returned to the hotel exhausted. The cake was still there and starting to dry out at the edges. It had become a grotesque object, an offering made to a family that had already forgotten me. I sat on the bed and wrote everything down. The names, the acronyms, the phrases I had heard, the connections. I had to organize my thoughts. I had to protect the truth before someone tried to make me disappear for real. And in the meantime, a silent voice grew inside me. Not one of revenge, but of affirmation. I was alive, and I hadn't finished writing my story. I can't precisely pinpoint the moment when I first suspected that what I was uncovering wasn't merely an emotional substitution, nor simply a family anomaly, but something with far deeper roots, darker undertones, and a more deliberate construction. If I recall correctly, it was the night I returned to my hotel, and there, within my email account, one that almost nobody used to reach me, I discovered an electronic invoice. This invoice was dated 3 years in the past and was addressed to me. It related to the purchase of a small property in a town I'd never been to. There was nothing visible about the sender. It seemed anonymous, but the header was clear. Yes, Mr. Livia, Arcodisk, LR, RRM. That was my full name, my tax identification number, and my address at the time. But I hadn't made any purchases in that town. On the document was a scanned signature, identical to my own, but I had never signed that particular document. My breath caught momentarily. A sudden gasp in my chest, as if life itself were desperately attempting to escape a body that had finally painfully realized it had been violated. I remembered that years earlier I had entrusted my daughter with a folder with some documents, bank statements, copies of proxies, notarial deeds, to scan in order to put everything in digital order. I had never worried about their return, never thought that that trust would turn into my condemnation, but that invoice was the proof. The first tangible proof that someone had used my identity, perhaps for years, with the aim not only of erasing me, but of diverting every asset, every property, every right that belonged to me. I opened an old cloud storage that I had once used, back when my late husband had convinced me to back up everything, and I found a pixelated copy of my tax code in a PDF from 2012. I compared it with the one on the Famiglia Tekvov. They were identical, up to the date of issue. There was a discrepancy. The year of birth was correct, but the day was brought forward by one. An almost imperceptible change, enough to create a duplicate code that on the surface seemed real, but that in a more in-depth archive would turn out to be false souls. A surgical tampering, an invisible cloning, a fiscal ghost. I felt empty, betrayed twice as a mother and as a citizen. Someone had taken my legal identity, my signature, my past, and turned it into merchandise. I began to investigate the property indicated. I found the land registry coordinates. It was a modest house, registered in my name but rented to third parties. I stumbled upon an old review online. It described the apartment as nice, comfortable, and quiet. Very kind owner, Mrs. Andolfi. I read that name and felt a lump in my throat out. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate move. Elvira had introduced herself to the entire world using my identity, and she had done so with such ease that not even the tenant seemed to have ever doubted it. The next day, I showed up in person at the land registry office, showed my document, and asked to verify the deeds in my name. The woman behind the counter typed silently, then frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The records show that you already submitted this request in person 3 weeks ago." I looked at her with steady eyes. "Ma'am, I've never been here." She hesitated, then printed out a copy of the application form. It had a signature, mine, but not my own. It was printed, and underneath it was a note in pen. "Please send a paper copy to your daughter's address due to difficulties accessing the network." My blood ran cold. They had constructed a perfect story. I, old, forgetful, unable to manage my affairs. They were attentive. On my behalf, a well-written play, with believable dialogue and well-trained actors, but they had not foreseen that I would reappear. Not like this, not with questions, not with open eyes. I asked the woman to print out every available document. Signed, sent, registered. She looked at me perplexed, but agreed. Coming out of there with a folder full of paper and poison, I sat down on a bench and remained silent. I could feel the wind on my face, but my face was still. The documents trembled slightly in my hands. Each page felt like a stab. Each line, a piece of my life subtly and expertly taken from me. That evening, back at the hotel, I locked myself in. And for the first time, I photographed each sheet and sent them to someone I hadn't heard from in years. An old colleague of my husband's, a retired lawyer who owed me a favor. I wrote him a few lines. I can explain everything now. But someone stole from me. Literally. "Look at these documents. Tell me if I can prove that I'm still me." I pressed send, then turned off the phone. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't write a dramatic diary, like you see in the movies. Instead, I simply sat on the bed and placed the folder on my chest. It felt like a protective shield, a new skin carefully sewn, over all the wounds I had always kept hidden from everyone. I still didn't know how it would end, but one thing was clear. Elvira was no longer just a face in my daughter's photographs. She was a life thief, a builder of identities, and I was living proof that she hadn't managed to erase everything. Barely more than a week had passed since it all started, a quiet beginning with a lemon tart and a whisper exchanged at the counter. But with each passing day, each hour, spent in silence searching for answers, it felt like living a lifetime trapped within a maze of distorted mirrors. I had gathered evidence, seen familiar faces in a different light, read my name on documents I had never signed, discovered property I had no idea I owned, and all of this had been triggered by a tiny gesture. A shaky handshake and a sentence, uttered through gritted teeth. "Ma'am, I shouldn't say it here." It was that boy, the cashier at the bakery, who had been the only one who had let the truth slip, the only one who had given me back the biggest doubt of my life with a single look. And that was precisely why I decided to go back there. I had to talk to him again. I had to know what he had seen, who had told him, who had instructed him to react this way when he heard my name. When I arrived in front of the shop, I immediately felt that something had changed. The shutters were down, not just closed, but dirty, covered in dust, as if no one had touched them in days. The sign that had previously said, "Closed for inventory," was now gone. In its place was only a faded strip of dried glue. No smell of pastries, no noise from the refrigerator, no light behind the glass. The window looked empty, bare, dead. I approached and knocked lightly. No answer. I looked to my side, towards the back entrance the boy had left from that night, secured with a rusty chain and a new padlock. Everything had been cleaned, removed, erased. He directed me to the bar on the one where the barmaid had told me about the short-term lease and the mysterious owner. She recognized me immediately. "She came back for the pastry shop, right?" She nodded. "Yes," I replied. "Do you happen to know what happened to the boy who worked there? The one with the short beard?" The woman shook her head. "We never heard from him again. He disappeared overnight. Not even the bread courier knew they had closed." They took everything in one night, and no one left an address. I asked her if she had ever known the boy's name. No, Jessie. Everyone called him Max, but I don't even know if that was his real name. I sighed and left. I stopped in front of the pastry shop, as one does in front of a shop, to a grave. There was something unsettling about the way it had been erased. There were no notes, no rental signs, and no attempts whatsoever at restoration, just an empty space, the result of a meticulous surgical removal. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that the boy knew too much. Too much to have been left there selling sweets. Too much to have been a mere employee. Perhaps he had been tasked with surveillance, monitoring, detecting signals, and I was the signal. A sudden idea came to me. I went back to the city library, where I had already spent hours digging through the digital records. I requested access to the records of active business licenses in recent months. I entered the name of the Dolce Rosa bakery. No results. I tried the physical address. Only one registered business appeared, but it wasn't a bakery. The company name was Aquila Project IT SRL, registered as a temporary event logistics company. While there seemed to be no link whatsoever to food or retail sales, it was nonetheless that address, that exact size, that very same store where I had bought the cake which I had never delivered. I printed out the details. The stated legal representative was a name I wasn't familiar with, but the email address did show a domain cryptic, relations.com. I searched for it online, but nothing. But the acronym EV, Elvira, was too vague to be evidence, but too specific to be coincidental. I asked if it was possible to obtain the company's articles of association. The librarian told me that an official request was needed. I took note, thanked her, and left. I felt surrounded by invisible walls. No matter how many times I thought I had caught a thread, it snapped. Every witness disappeared. Every clue vanished into the shadows. But I didn't give up. I went back to the pastry shop, looked at the electricity meter still installed, and photographed the serial number. The next day, I went to the energy office and asked for information on who had paid the bill in the last few months. There, too, no real name. Just a trust company with its registered office at an address that turned out to be a post office with private boxes. I understood more and more that the network was dense and that whoever had built it left no witnesses. The boy, Max, or whatever his real name was, hadn't just disappeared. He had been killed, perhaps transferred, perhaps threatened, perhaps worse. I returned to the hotel with a heavy heart. Sitting on the bed, I opened the box of cake again. It was still there, hardened. Its sweet scent had transformed into a sour odor. I cut a slice and placed it on a plate, but I didn't eat it. I stared at it for hours. That's all that was left, the last tangible trace of that boy, of the warning, and of that door I had crossed not knowing where it led. Then I took the plate, went out onto the balcony, and threw it in the dumpster on the street. A simple gesture, but full of meaning, because from that moment on, there would be no more sweets. Only truth. I wasn't ready to knock. Not yet, but I knew I could no longer stay away from that house. I needed to see it, not out of nostalgia. I did not want reconciliation. What I truly desired was to know the true extent of the deception. I required seeing with my eyes the face of my absence physically present, amidst those walls that had formerly embraced me as well. When I still thought there was a place for a mother, for a grandmother, for the woman who had signed every check and shaken every hand in the hardest moments. On a rainless morning, my heart, heavy with a mix of emotions, I dressed modestly before taking a bus to the residential area where my daughter was living with her newly formed family. I brought nothing with me. No gifts, no apologies, no words. Just a thin folder in my bag and the decision to remain silent. I chose to get off one stop early. I wanted to walk slowly closer to see if my body would react, if my memory would give way. I passed in front of the old park where I used to take my granddaughter to play. The bench was still there with its faded paint, but I didn't feel tenderness. I felt distance. Things seemed the same, yet nothing belonged to me. When I reached the street, I immediately recognized the gate. New, black, shiny, different from the wooden one that opened with a creak. That first time, when I came to help with the moving, I was the one who opened it, carrying pots and pans and some ironed linen. Now that gate, it felt like a boundary, not an invitation. I didn't go in. I leaned against the opposite wall, pretending to check my phone. From my position, I had a view of the interior of the garden, the open windows, and the side patio. The house seemed bigger, more cared for. They had added a wooden pergola and ivory curtains. The curtain was just slightly raised, enough to see what I absolutely should not have seen. And yet I stayed there. I looked, without blinking. There were voices, laughter, and then I saw Elvira, the woman who had taken my place. She was sitting on the sofa, the sage green one I had given to my daughter, and in her hands she was holding my grandson wrapped in a blanket with the initials that I had embroidered years ago. She cradled him naturally as she talked to my daughter. They were laughing, drinking something from cups that I recognized, cups that I had given for our Forrester wedding anniversary. On the wall above them, there was a large frame with a family photo. My daughter, her husband, the baby, and Elvira. No sign of me, not a trace, not an image, not an object. Not even one of my paintings, my letters. Nothing. Then the door opened. My daughter's husband came out into the garden holding an envelope. From a distance I couldn't see what was inside, but he opened it, read it, then showed it to Elvira, who nodded, then hugged it to her chest. It was a document, a deed perhaps. It wasn't joy, it was relief. As if they had finally closed something. A contract, a transfer, an inheritance. I had seen too many signatures in the last few days not to recognize that gesture. At that moment, I felt no pain, only a fierce lucidity. I was looking at a stage set carefully constructed with the very bricks of my life. Every detail had been taken from my memory and fitted into a puzzle in which I wasn't expected. They hadn't thrown my existence away. They had recycled it, reused it, adapted it to a new actress, one more docile, more manageable, one who wouldn't ask questions. I was there, just a few meters away. No one knew. No one imagined. I could have crossed out on the street. I would knock then, look my daughter directly in the eyes and ask her why. But I didn't. Not yet. Because I knew the answers wouldn't be honest, because I knew they would deny it. They would pretend not to understand Mecca. And I didn't want excuses. I wanted truth or justice. As I walked away from the house, I noticed a white box sitting on the garden table. It had a thin, delicate ribbon, tied around to the kind of wrapping you'd expect for sweets. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but my stomach clenched. I believe it was a cake. Perhaps a lemon cake, possibly even. That specific one. But not delivered by me. It arrived anyway, and it was used. No one had even noticed that I was missing. No one had bothered to question her. I walked 2 blocks without looking back. Then I stopped, opened my bag, and pulled out the folder. Inside were copies of the falsified documents, the invoices, the signatures, the land registry. I held them tightly in my hands as if they contained my identity, the original, not the copy. I read them one by one under the dim light of a street lamp, and then, without thinking about it, I took out a note and wrote a few words, a few dry lines. I am not dead, and now I know everything. I carefully folded the paper, inserted it into an envelope, and then, being sure not to be seen, deposited it in my daughter's mailbox. There was no anger in my gestures, only precision. Neither yelling nor weeping mattered any longer. My only need was to be observed. And this was my first appearance, the first crack in the perfect wall they had built. Because those who live a lie always fear the truth return even when it arrives. Without noise, without noise. I did not return to the hotel immediately. After putting the note in the mailbox, I walked slowly through the neighborhood, as if I were looking for something that still belonged to me, a detail, a smell, a sound that would tell me that, at least for a few centimeters, I had not been completely erased, but every corner seemed familiar only in form, no longer in meaning, Aguli, no longer in meaning. It was like walking through a dream that others had ended for you, choosing the ending without asking your consent. I no longer felt like a daughter or a mother, just a woman who had made the mistake of trusting too much and who he had begun using his own absence as a weapon against them. I had left a few words, but precise, sharp, impossible to misunderstand. I am not dead, and now I know everything. No name, no signature, because those who have been forgotten no longer need introductions. Identity, in some cases, lies in the implicit threat, in the very fact that one has returned. I returned to the hotel around 8 o'clock in the evening. The sky was already dark, and the orange lights of the street lamps gave me the strange feeling that the entire world was silently watching what I had done. I didn't say a word to the receptionist. There was no way. I went into the room, took off my coat with slow movements, and sat down by the window. I didn't turn on the television or the computer. I stood there staring into space, trying to predict what the next move would be, whether my daughter would call me, whether Elvira would react, whether someone would try to deny it. But it wasn't a phone call that broke the silence, it was an email. A curt notification at 10:70 p.m. Subject, send automatically. Record external device, an unknown sender, but the file name spoke volumes. Front date footage to today. My heart skipped a beat. I opened the attachment. It was a short video, a file only a few minutes long, recorded by a surveillance camera focused directly on the mailbox. It was me, my daughter coat, my uncertain step, my hand opening my bag, taking out the envelope, putting it in, and then my figure walking away without looking back. All accompanied by absolute silence, broken only by the occasional distant sound of traffic. The caption below, superimposed on the screen, automatically displayed the message. Movement detected at 1739, side door. Active quay Sudipa. Who had sent me that video, and why? The message contained no text, no explanation, no threats. Just the video, just proof that someone was watching me. Perhaps the same person who was pulling the strings behind that entire network, or perhaps someone who wanted to help me. But in both cases, it was clear that my presence had been noticed. I was no longer a ghost. I had left a footprint. The next morning, I received another message, this time from an number. Just a sentence. He dared. No sender. No signature. I immediately blocked the number, but I kept the screenshot. I knew that from that moment on, things would no longer remain silent. I had broken the established balance. I had taken the first decisive step forward, and now inevitably they would be forced to react, and I, of course, was fully prepared. I had learned to keep quiet for years, but I had never been blind. I had seen everything. I remembered everything. And now, I knew where to strike. I went to the bank where, years before, I had opened an account with my daughter to manage family expenses after my husband's death. Back then, joint signatures were a form of trust. Now they were a potential minefield. I showed my document and asked to check the account status. The employee checked then, looked at me with a confused expression. Madam, it seems that you closed your account 8 months ago. I didn't answer. I asked to see the closing documents. They showed me a copy. The signature was identical to mine, but the handwriting was slightly different. Too neat. Too perfect. It was a scan, not a signature, watermarked. And the notification address was different. It was that of my daughter's house. I asked if there had been any suspicious movements before the closing. The man hesitated, then stood up and returned a few minutes later with a printout. Frequent mots phase, frequent transfers to another account in Andolfi's name. I thanked him, took the copies, and left. I had enough to sue, enough to bring everything down, but it still wasn't enough. I wanted to see how far they had gone. I wanted to look in the face at the abyss they had dug beneath me. Because it's not just the theft of a name that destroys a woman. It's the belief that they can do it with impunity. It's the normality with which they replace you, with which they sit on your couch, hold your grandchild in their arms, use your cup, print your signature, play your role. In the afternoon, I received an anonymous call. I didn't answer. Then a voicemail came. It was my daughter's voice, bewildered, tense. Mom, I found an envelope today. It's a joke. Have you been here? Why? I didn't answer. Not yet. Because it wasn't a real question. It was panic. The panic of someone who fears that the truth has returned. And I was finally its forme. There are endings that don't come with applause, or slam doors, or dramatic tears. There are endings that happen inside, at the precise moment in which a woman stops looking for explanations and starts writing her own conditions. That's exactly where I was, in the semi-darkness of a hotel room that smelled of neutral walls and orderly solitude, when I realized that I wouldn't get anything back. Not trust, not motherhood as I had known it, not the honesty of promises, but I still had something that no one had been able to take away from me completely. The choice of how to respond, what voice to use, what trace to leave behind me. Hey. The night after my daughter's voicemail, I couldn't sleep. I paced the worn carpet of the room for hours, rereading the documents, the searches, the falsified invoices, the accesses to the accounts, the inaccurate signatures, the photographs of Elvira with my grandson in her arms. No tears, no sobs, just silence, mine. The same silence that they had mistaken for weakness, but which had now become a blade. I opened the computer, opened the file of the will that I had drawn up years before with the help of a notary friend, and I began to modify it, line by line. My daughter was no longer a beneficiary, nor was the nephew. The remaining assets, shortly after the disguised appropriations, were assigned to 3 organizations. A center for women who had been victims of financial abuse by family members, a school library in a rural area where I had taught for 2 years, and a shelter for the elderly without relatives. Each sum was divided into equal parts. Each step was digitally countersigned, and then, at the bottom of the document, I added a clause. Should Mrs. Elvira Andolfi or someone on her behalf legally challenge the provisions expressed here, all the attached materials, see attachments A, B, C, will publicly disclose through the press and social media. No, it was blackmail. It was self-defense. It was the woman's voice that they had tried to silence. The following day, I went to a notary. Not just any notary, one who knew my husband, one who still called me professor. He greeted me with an uncertain smile, as if he didn't know whether I was there to make peace with the past or to burn it down. I handed him the file, the New Testament, and the entire chronology of my last days. He didn't react with scandal, but with respect. He asked, "Shall we proceed immediately?" He nodded, without waiting another day. And while he scanned the documents, I got up, went to the window, and looked out. There was an old man feeding the pigeons. Passers-by walked by as if the world were normal. It was, in fact. Only I had stopped being part of it according to the rules that others had imposed. In the following days, the first signs arrived, an email. From my daughter this time, long, full of question marks and exclamation points, sentences like it wasn't my intention. You misunderstood, I never wanted to hurt you. Followed by, Elvira is not to blame. It was all done to protect you. You were the one who walked away. I read it only once, then I filed it away because it wasn't a letter. It wasn't a letter, it was a cover-up, a patch too small to cover up the entire damage. The next day, a paper letter arrived, with a photograph attached. It was the baby's baptism. I wasn't there, but Elvira was. With a caption written in pen, "We can change the past, but we can seek some form of forgiveness." I sealed the envelope and put it in the last suitcase that I hadn't yet unpacked. I sealed it with adhesive tape. That suitcase would never be opened again. The final step was a visit to the headquarters of the association to which I had donated the bulk of my inheritance. A woman with gray hair tied back and strong hands took me aside and said, "Why are you doing this?" I simply replied, "Because I don't want any other woman to be taken away so easily." She didn't ask any more questions. She took me to see the library that was being renovated. There were shelves still empty, but already with the smell of new paper. For once, that emptiness didn't hurt it. It was a promise, a rebirth. A few days later, I moved to a small apartment with a sea view, where the sound of the waves was the only voice I heard in the morning. I'd only packed a few things: a faded photo of my husband, a ring, a scarf handmade by a loved one, and of course my real name. That true name remained, stubbornly refusing to be deleted regardless of their many efforts. I didn't receive any more messages from my daughter, or from Evere, or from anyone who had been watching my moves in the previous weeks. Maybe they had understood that it was over. Maybe they hadn't. But it didn't matter because now they weren't the ones who decided any more. A month later, I received a postcard with no return address. Just a drawing done by a child's hand. A house, a tree, a sun, and underneath in uncertain capital letters the message for Grandma. It wasn't signed. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but I understood and put it in the drawer next to the bed. Not to reopen a door, but to remember that even when you're erased, there's always a trace that can't be tamed. Blood, memory, silence that, if used well, can make more noise than 1,000 screams. My story ended like that. Not with a hug, not with revenge, but with a decision. My own choice.